All right, well, let's get it started. On behalf of my colleagues in the Center for the Study of Adolescent Risk and Resilience, we welcome Dr. Michael Prinzing for today's presentation. Michael did his PhD at UNC in philosophy, finished up in 2022. He's now in a postdoc at Baylor, a remote postdoc that keeps him local most of the time, and he also has a connection to the PAR Center for Ethics over at UNC, a consulting research scientist. I know Michael because we each have a grant, mine in collaboration with Aaron Davison here through Templeton, and the group of us who have the grants from the last call communicate with one another and collaborate as needed. Though a philosopher, Michael has strong empirical chops, which I guess is increasingly less uncommon for philosophers. In fact,
pretty rare.
Still pretty rare, certainly at the level he has first author publications in Journal of Personality and Social Psych, Review of General Psychology, Personality and Social Psych Bulletin, and Journal of Positive Psychology. And in fact, his postdoc appointment at Baylor is in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience. So he's a philosophy sort of on his way to converting to a psychological scientist. His broad work is on morality and well-being. And that's interesting and useful, and maybe we'll get some examples for that. The reason we have him here is because at our first meeting of the grantees for this Templeton project, as part of some conversation we were having about narrative data and coding, it became apparent that Michael had not only interest in, but a lot of expertise in using new technology, particularly AI, for this purpose. And whether it's there yet or not in terms of how good it is, he'll tell us, we'll see. That's the idea, to see what the potential is for using GPT in its current state to do what humans take a very long time to do, especially when sample size is large. So with that said, welcome, Michael.
Thank you. That was very kind. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny. I was presenting some of the same stuff at SPSB a couple of weeks ago, and there was a data blitz, and I had 5 minutes. Today we have 3 hours, so buckle up. Yeah, so my plan for the session today is to do kind of 3 parts. Part 1, I'm just going to share some of the stuff that I've been doing. I'm going to talk about text analysis or content coding measurement in general and what I think is cool about it. And then I'm going to try and get you hyped about this idea. I'm going to show you some of the stuff I've been doing with GPT models for text analysis. And then probably we'll want a break and we can have some coffee and mill around and go to the bathroom and all that kind of thing. After that, we'll come back and I'll show you how to do this stuff. I'll talk about some of the tools that are available, the tool I've been using. It's a bit of the Wild West. There are lots of different things, lots of different ways of trying to do it. But then, having shown you some of that, we can pivot to part 3, which will be kind of a, I hope, more of a conversation and a discussion where it'll kind of evolve into, I'll tell you about some best practices that I've been starting to think about, some stuff about reproducibility and how to get the best results, thinking a little more broadly about when you might not want to do this kind of thing, when other techniques might be better. And I'm hoping that will turn very quickly into, just us kind of chatting about what are the risks, what are the challenges, what are the opportunities and that kind of thing. Maybe even brainstorming ideas of how to apply this kind of stuff. Maybe you have data you want to do something with. Okay, so let me first, as I always do, make note that science is a team sport. These are some people that I've worked with on various projects I'm going to talk about today. Elizabeth Bounds and Sarah Schnitker on the left are both at Baylor. Then there's Barb Fredrickson and Michael Vasquez, who are both at UNC. And then Kate LaFawn is at London School of Economics. So I'm going to make mention to some of them at certain points along the way. But these are people who've been involved with a lot of the stuff that I've been doing. Okay, so there's been this trend across the social sciences, increasingly, I think, for people to turn to text as a form of data. And the intuitive idea is actually really plausible that, natural language is the primary mode of human communication. And it's how we preserve our thoughts and ideas, our hopes and dreams and fears and loves for future people or for people in other places. And so if you can use text as a form of evidence, that's going to give you potentially a really nice insight into humans, the way that they think, the way that they arrange themselves in societies, and so on. And in psychology in particular, the kind of common way to think about this is you have text from a person, so you could maybe find evidence in that text of certain psychological constructs. And if you could do that, then maybe you could measure things through the text that people have produced. So people have used this kind of approach across a variety of fields to study things like, the spread of misinformation online, to study the success or failure of different companies, linguistic styles of politicians, maybe before and after military conflicts, or personality styles of different politicians, and like what predicts, odds of being elected, that kind of thing. So there's some really cool stuff that can be done here. And I'm going to just very quickly kind of on terminology. I sometimes kind of go back and forth between the language of text analysis and the language of content coding. It seems like that's a kind of disciplinary or even maybe subdisciplinary divide where people who are more in what some people call computational social science, or even like political science and other fields will tend to talk about text analysis. People in social psychology will tend to talk about content coding. I take it to be basically the same sort of thing. It's a form of psychological assessment that involves converting text into numeric values, right? The idea is, the text contains a wealth of psychological information, but we're trying to extract that information in a rigorous and precise way so that we can take advantage of the fact that there's this kind of rich, nuanced information there, but still get to do quantitative analysis, right? So we're doing something that's kind of like right on the edge of qualitative and quantitative, where we're taking something that is in and of itself qualitative and we're trying to quantify it. I think this approach to psychological assessment has a few distinct strengths over fixed response instruments that otherwise dominate the field. What is a fixed response instrument? It is the sort of thing you're probably intimately aware of or familiar with. It's standard survey measures where there's a fixed set of statements or questions, and then the response options are a predetermined list of things like strongly agree, strongly disagree. So it'd be like, how satisfied are you with your life? Or I'm very satisfied with my life. Please respond. Strongly disagree, disagree, right. So the reason obviously people use those is because it makes it incredibly easy to quantify the response. You say, strongly disagree. 1, disagree. 2, super easy. But by its very design, a fixed response instrument is constraining a person's ability to express themselves. And that's the point. You don't want them to say whatever they want to say. You don't want them to be freely available to, say whatever thoughts and feelings come to mind, because then you don't know what to do with it. Like, how do I do stats with that? So what you do is intentionally constrain their ability to express themselves. And that can be useful, but all things being equal, surely you would want to be able to get some of that nuance, some of that richness and complexity. I mean, if you're wondering about that, talk to your friends who do qualitative research. Like, they'll talk your ear off for a few hours about why that's really, really valuable. People can tell you things you wouldn't have thought to ask about. They can express themselves, even if it's on a topic that you would have asked about, with a lot more nuance, a lot more sophistication, a lot more idiosyncratic difference than you could get from, say, agree on a fixed, statement. And you don't actually just have to take my word for it. Here are a couple of examples of cases where people have found text-based measures actually outperform in terms of predictive validity fixed response instrument. So this is a paper by Oscar Schell about predicting cooperative behaviors using fixed response instruments versus text-based measures of the same construct, specifically subjective well-being outcomes like satisfaction with life. If you just give people like the satisfaction with life scale, people have been using it for like decades, and you compare that with a text-based measure for the same thing. So it's like, basically, how satisfied are you with your life? Please explain. And people just write stuff, and then you score that. He found actually you can predict cooperative behavior more effectively with a text-based measure. For example, I think this one is a lot of fun. Google Maps, and you look at businesses and things, you always have that star rating, 1 to 5 stars out of however many reviews. So people will write a review, they'll write some text, and then they'll give a star rating for the business. So you might think, I could predict the economic success of the business from that star rating. Well, kind of. They're really crappy. Like they're terrible predictors of economic success for companies. But you could also look at that text. And if you score the text for emotionality and you say, how much do people like this business? How much does this review indicate that they like this business? That is a better predictor, according to this paper, of marketplace success. So they look at box office reviews and financial success for movies. They look at reservations at restaurants and stuff like that using publicly available data on the internet. And they find, yeah, the star rating sucks. It's a pretty terrible predictor, but text analytic measures, emotionality of the review, that actually is a pretty good predictor. So that's cool. Another strength, I think, of text analytic measures is they at least have the potential to avoid some of the limitations, well-known limitations of self-report measures. So, I'm thinking of things like social desirability or self-presentation, self-enhancement biases. Because the idea is a person's own words can sometimes convey things that they didn't intend to convey or that they didn't even realize that they were conveying. And of course, a content coding or text analytic measure could just be a version of a self-report. It could just be like in that Oscar Schell paper, how satisfied are you with your life? Do you feel like your life is characterized by harmony? I think that was his sort of vocal construct. But if you did that, well then, you just have a different kind of self-report. It's not a fixed response self-report, but it's still probably going to have those same kinds of limitations. But you don't have to do that. And in fact, typically, content coding types of measures don't just ask, hey, how satisfied are you with your life? Please explain. They'll give you an opportunity to somehow convey or express your satisfaction with life without directly asking for it. So, people are given an opportunity to reveal crucial facts about themselves that maybe they couldn't even report in the first place. So there's some kind of classic studies by people like McAdams and Pennybaker that show what you can do with text-based measures, that things people would be unlikely or even unable to report. So just as one example, this is an old paper, but this is from 2003, where they find when people are lying, there are certain linguistic tendencies that they have that people don't tend to have when they're telling the truth. And this is in 2003, it's a sort of smaller sample in an older study, but they found you could predict, not super accurately, but definitely better than chance, whether or not somebody is lying by scoring the transcript of what they said for some of these characteristic features. Obviously not something you could do with a self-report. The third strength that I want to mention is the potential for text-based measures to expand the scope of research, both across populations and across historical periods. The quantity of publicly available text from digitized archives, from social media, from various websites is enormous, and it's always growing. So if there's text out there and you get really good at figuring out psychological constructs from things people have written, well, then you don't actually need the participants in your study to participate in your study. You could study the personality types of politicians, as people have done, using text from speeches on the floor of Congress. You could study, similarly, billionaires, celebrities, all kinds of people who would probably never participate in a research study. You could even study dead people. There's a really cool paper by Mohammed Attari and Joe Henrich that came out actually just last year talking about this idea. And it's a very sort of speculative kind of paper, of course, but they're talking about the potential to do historical psychology. You could, if there's enough text from enough people who are not alive anymore, you could try and study changes in the way that people have thought over time. And in fact, Josh Jackson has a paper that came out also last year in JPSP that does something kind of like that, where they're interested in how people reason about morality and moral character in particular. So you could think of moral character in a fairly unidimensional kind of way where people can be kind of bad people or good people or anywhere in between, and there's just this kind of single dimension of moral character along which people vary. Or you could have a much more nuanced, multi-dimensional kind of conceptualization of character where, somebody might be really patient and really courageous, but they might also be really low in compassion. So you can have a kind of mix of moral qualities, right? So basically what they were interested in is, to what extent do people kind of do that dimension reduction in their head? When they think about somebody's moral character, to what extent are they inclined to just say good to bad, somewhere in between, versus, well, it's complicated, there are all these different kind of characteristics. And they have some ideas about why exactly that would happen, and that's not really relevant for us, but what they were able to do is take text from, in this case, just the English language, but over the last couple of hundred years, look at the way that people think about moral character, and they were able to find trends over the course of a couple of centuries. I think that's really cool. Of course, these kinds of approaches are going to suffer from a particular limitation of their own, which is that publicly available text may and probably often is going to reflect a kind of carefully curated public-facing persona that may not really reflect the way a person thinks or feels. But there's at least the potential there, if you can, figure out solutions to that kind of problem, to study not just people who would actually participate in a typical study, which tends to be mostly female and mostly white and mostly alive. That would be really, really cool. Of course, can't talk about the strengths without the weaknesses. I think in the past, this kind of approach to psychological assessment has been pretty severely limited by just the fact that you got to do it by hand, right? So manual coding, meaning having humans going through and scoring text, is still today the gold standard, but considered by many people. And it's certainly historically the way that you basically had to do it. Why is it considered the gold standard? Well, because generally speaking, having humans go through and score text according to whatever criteria you want to use is going to get you more reliable and more valid scores than a computer automated approach. That manual coding is incredibly time and labor intensive and tedious too. Like if you ever, actually I'm really curious, how many people in this room have done a study like this where you have a bunch of text, you have humans go through and code it? Everybody. Oh, wow. Huge surprise. How long does it normally take? 87,000? An entire career is like, yeah, so either that means you're going to have a fairly small sample size, or that means you're going to have a huge team of undergraduates that you're trying to coerce into doing this tedious stuff. Or, yeah, you just give up on it and you don't do it. And of course, even after that, how do you know that the scores that they gave you are reliable and valid? Well, you can calculate the inter-rater reliability. Usually that sucks the first time you do it. Usually the first time you have your, motivated team of RAs go through, 50, 100, or however many, you look at the inter-rater reliability and you're like, wow, we got to try this again. Let's figure out how we can fix these scoring criteria. Let's figure out how we can coordinate on these. And, you have to meet several times probably, and you kind of coordinate and you do this whole process. So that takes a very long time, but then suppose you achieve inter-rater reliability and you're happy with that and you go, okay, well, how do we know this is actually measuring the thing that we're trying to measure? Well, you can do the standard kind of stuff for construct validity. You look at correlations among, measures and you say, well, it should probably correlate with this. It should probably negatively correlate with that. It probably shouldn't be related to that. But you can only do that after you've got your scores. So suppose you went to all of this trouble to get these scores, to get them inter-rater reliable, and then you're like, not a valid measure. That sucks. So yeah, for all of these reasons, basically, people just have a tendency not to use these kinds of methods very often, despite their strengths. There are other ways people try to sometimes get around that. You can try and crowdsource this kind of thing. So instead of having, say, 5 RAs code, 100 each, you could try and have 100 prolific or MTurk workers code 5 each, something like that. Of course, that reintroduces these concerns about validity and reliability. Are they giving you good scores? These aren't trained workers. These are just random people on the internet. So for that reason, an increasingly common strategy is to turn to computer automation. Initially, computer automated approaches were pretty simple. They're word counting, basically. So people will sometimes call this a dictionary-based approach, because the basic idea is you create lists of words that are reflective, you think, of the construct that you're interested in. And then you go through the text and you count how many times do these words appear. And maybe you have some kind of fancy way of weighting them where like some words are more important than others or something like that. But that's the basic idea. So this is, probably you're familiar with the linguistic inquiry and word count. That's the sort of well-known software for this. And if you go on Google Scholar and you search for papers, Luke, you'll find, since like 2000, there are like 10, 20,000 papers with this software. So it's been incredibly popular and actually can do some really cool stuff. So there's this cool paper from 2015 where they were looking at Twitter messages. And if you score tweets using a dictionary-based approach for positive and negative emotions words, you can actually predict heart disease risk at the county level in the United States. And also, I think they had all-cause mortality as well, although that's not in the title. Oh yeah, no, that's in the title. Yeah. So simple, seems to be effective, at least for certain things. That's kind of cool. But obviously in the last few years, 5, 10 years maybe, there have been some real strides in the field of natural language processing, automated text analysis. And I think of particular interest, the main one that people are excited about is large language models. So BERT is kind of one of the original kind of big names in this. BERT stands for, sometimes you gotta have notes, bidirectional encoder representations from transformers. See why they abbreviate. It was developed by Google in 2018 and quickly became very, very popular. The key development in BERT compared with previous language models was the transformer architecture that people use. And that has led to what now people talk about large language models. Basically, it's a machine learning technique that uses neural networks. And I don't know much about it, but they've been used actually in psychology with some rather impressive results. So here's another Oscar Schell paper where he's again looking at subjective well-being measures in text, and this time just correlating them with the fixed response kind of self-reports. And what he finds, as advertised in the title, is the correlation between those two was about as strong as you could expect given the internal reliability of the measures, of the self-report measure. So that's kind of cool. The key limitation, of course, of these kinds of large language models has been that in order to get them off the ground, you need a large amount of training data. So these are input-output pairs that you use to tell the model, how do you respond when I give you a prompt? And by large, I mean thousands, at least. So probably, if you're just a psychology researcher, you don't really have that. But you might be able to find something on the internet, or you might be able to find a pre-trained version of a model like BERT. So the Hugging Face library is this website. You can go on huggingface.co. They have this huge library of large language models pre-trained to do all kinds of different things, including sentiment analysis, like the Twitter paper I was talking about, humor detection. Is there a joke in this text? Is specific emotion attributions, like is this person expressing joy or love or anger or something like that? So if you happen to be able to go on the Hugging Face library and find something that suits your interests, great. It's probably pretty decent. But if you are trying to do something less common, and of course, Hugging Face is not usually, the people who contribute to this library are generally not psychologists. Generally, they're computer scientists, something like that. Often, a lot of the stuff on there is for businesses. So they want to do stuff to help their business, and they want to use a large language model to analyze, things people are writing about their business. So probably you're not going to find something that you're interested in. At least if you're interested in something kind of sophisticated, interested in scoring constructs that are more nuanced or novel than, say, positive sentiment, or is this a joke, something like that. So for example, if you wanted to do something like, I want to figure out how spiritual people are based off of what they've written, or I want to see how intellectually humble is this person. You're not going to find that. Actually, I looked. I searched for intellectual humility, spirituality on Hugging Face, 0 results. So unless you happen to find something that other people are interested in or have studied a lot, or there's just happens to be a lot of publicly available text that has already been coded in some way by humans, you're kind of out of luck. So another way of thinking about what's limiting about transformer-based models, large language models like BERT, is the task specificity of the model. The model will tend to do one thing, and it might do it pretty well, but if that one thing is not the thing that you want to do, then it doesn't work for you. And then something changed. The latest advance in large language models has been to try and give them domain general abilities with language. And most famously, it kind of came on the scene with OpenAI's ChatGPT. ChatGPT is an interface that you can use to communicate with the language model, which is just going to be a GPT, i.e. a generative pre-trained transformer. So the idea is it is pre-trained with enough, however many terabytes or petabytes even of text data to where it just kind of can speak natural languages in a very domain general way, as opposed to it knows how to do one very specific thing. Of course, there are others. Google has Bard, and I think the new, the latest and greatest Google LLM is called Gemini. And supposedly, it's as good or better than GPT-4. So maybe I'll be switching over sometime soon. But just as an illustration of what these kinds of models can do, this is a figure from a paper that was doing performance tests on GPT-4 when it first came out, and in particular comparing it with GPT-3 or 3.5. But they had the model do a bunch of standardized tests, including the bar exam and the GRE. I imagine a lot of people in this room took the GRE. Do you remember what percentile you scored in on the GRE verbal? I remember mine. GPT got 99, 99th percentile. Does that make you feel inferior? It's pretty wild. But it's partly wild because of what these models really are under the hood. They're basically fancy autocomplete. When you start typing something on your phone and it's saying, is this the word you want to type? It's basically the same thing, only way, way, way more complicated. It's going to try and say, what is the most probable next word in this sequence given everything that's come before? That's all it's doing. And yet, something about that ability, which in and of itself seems so simple, if you get it sophisticated enough in doing that, means it can get 90th percentile on the bar exam and 99th on the GRE verbal. That's pretty wild. So that suggests maybe now that we have these new kinds of large language models, we could have it do the same kind of stuff that a human could do, but we can have it do it in 10 minutes instead of 6 months. That would be very exciting. Is that true? Well, there are very, very few papers on this topic thus far, and almost none of them are published. So just looking at some of the preprints that are available, a number of them have been used to do categorization tasks. So these are the kind of things where I don't want a continuous score. I just want you to, maybe apply a dichotomous, is this X or not? Or among the following categories, which does this fall into? And in this particular study, this is by Mellon et al. It's a preprint. They had a data set from one of these, big national studies. I think this was in the UK, where they asked respondents in the study, what do you think is the most important issue facing our country today? Just write something. And so they could write climate change, they could write, income inequality, they could write, national defense, whatever they thought was most important. And then as a part of this big national study, humans were tasked with categorizing these different things. And they had a few different levels of granularity. So there was one where there's like 50 different categories, but then they had a simplified one that was 13 different categories. And so in this paper, what Mellon et al. Did was they said, okay, we have the text, we have what the original human said. Now let's see, can we compare that with another human, GPT-3, so this is actually old, this is even before GPT 3.5. And then an older technology for natural language processing, it's a support vector machine, but the details of that are not super important. It's one of these ones where you need training data. So what they did was they said, we have this huge, 500,000 participant sample. We'll select randomly some of those to be the training data, and then we'll select another random sample, and that'll be the test data. And so they have two different versions. So on the x-axis here of this figure, there's random and then unique random. There's a lot of repetition in what people say. How many people are going to say climate change? How many people are going to say income inequality? Well, if you just draw a random sample of 1,000, you'll get a lot of those overlaps. But you could alternatively draw a random unique sample where they're all different. Every single one is different. So what this is showing is what is the percent agreement with that original human score for a human, for GPT-3, and for these two different other language models. Well, basically everybody tends to do pretty well, around 90% or better, if you have a truly random sample with a lot of repetition. So what that tells you is there are some kinds of answers that are really common that it tends to do, it tends to be pretty easy to categorize. But then there are some of these less common ones that only are appearing in the unique sample, the unique random sample, that are a little harder to score. But a human, regardless, does about 90% or better agreement with the original human. That's pretty great. Then GPT-3, about 85%. And then these other language models, not so great, like 65, 75%. And actually, it's kind of interesting. So there's two versions of the support vector machine. One of them is SVM 1000. That's trained with 100 pairs of input-output, so 1,000 rows of training data. The other one is 576,000 rows of training data. And it's better. It's not that much better. It's kind of surprising. So that's cool. Here's another paper. This one got a lot of attention on Twitter and was featured prominently at SPSB a couple of weeks ago. Rathje and colleagues took GPT 3.5 and GPT 4, and they had them do a series of content coding or text analytic tasks that involved classifying tweets as either positive, negative, or neutral. There's some other stuff they did with news headlines. Again, performance is going to be assessed in terms of agreement with a human coder. So notice on the x-axis here, it's labeled true labels. I think there's one of the interesting things about some of these initial papers is the extent to which they have a tendency to just assume that the pre-existing human coding is right. And they'll sometimes even use this language of the ground truth. They put it in scare quotes, but still they're like just assuming that that's the right score, which, as I was highlighting earlier, is a pretty questionable assumption. But anyway, the true labels and then the predicted labels by these two language models. Again, this is an ordinal scale. It's not a continuous, but the tweet is either negative, neutral, or positive in its sentiment. And the models did actually pretty well. Curiously, GPT-3 actually did a little bit better. Its total accuracy, 60% of the time, was the same as the original human, versus GPT-4 was only 57%. Although if you look at this kind of grid, what you see is GPT-4 is more accurate for predicting negative and positive. It's just less accurate for predicting neutral. So it has this tendency to say it's either positive or negative, and it's sort of under accurately has a tendency to not say neutral. So that's pretty cool. They did another thing in this paper where they had not truly continuous, but roughly continuous. You have a 7-point scale for attributing, again, overall sentiment, but also specific emotions. And the first thing they wanted to do is just compare, correlations with human ratings between Luke, the old kind of classic that people use, and GPT 3.5 and 4. And if you look at the correlations for Luke, between Luke scores and human ratings, they're pretty bad. Correlations are about 0.2, 0.3. But then if you look at GPT 3.5 or 4, they look a lot better. They're more like 0.55, 0.75, somewhere in that range. So that's cool. Looks like we're doing a lot better than some of these older approaches. We're kind of assuming that the original humans got it right. These papers generally don't do a lot of documentation of where those human codings came from. But if the humans got it right, then GPT is doing a pretty decent job of getting it right too. Probably not quite as good. It's not a perfect correlation, but it's certainly a lot better than Luke. So what's next? Well, I think one thing that would be interesting to try and do next is look at something a little more sophisticated. So again, like if you want to do sentiment analysis, that's a pretty simple kind of thing to score for. You can already do it pretty well with BERT and some of these other models. So why don't we try something harder? Why don't we try something like the more kind of conceptually nuanced things that we were talking about before, like intellectual humility or spirituality? Let's do something like that. Other thing we might try and do is have some benchmarks besides human ratings. So we could look at not just does this language model agree with what a human said, but what is the correlation between each of those and a self-report? Kind of like Oscar Schell was doing earlier. What is the correlation between each of those and a behavioral measure? Let's do something like that. So what I'm going to show you next are a couple of different studies where I was using GPT models to assess spirituality, partly because that's just what I had data available for. We had a lot of text about this. We had self-reports and behavioral measures and all kinds of things. But I also think it's kind of a cool test case, partly because, as I mentioned, there's no Hugging Face model to do this kind of thing. This is the sort of thing that if you wanted to do a text analysis with a large language model prior to GPT, you couldn't have done this because there just aren't any models pre-trained to do this. And it's not even clear where you would get the text data to do the pre-training unless you happen to have run a bunch of studies on this already and you just have the data sitting around on your hard drive. You can't go, like, it's not obvious how you would go on the internet and find something like this, right? So if GPTs can do pretty well on this, then one, it's cool that they did well, but two, it shows that this is moving us beyond something that we had already with BERT or other kinds of models where you could just come up with something and say, I have a new construct. Nobody's talked about this before. Nobody's studied this before, but I'm really interested in this idea. And how am I going to score it? Well, I'm going to try and develop some self-reports, but I also want to do something that's not a self-report. Maybe because, say, you're studying something like intellectual humility, where humility is notoriously difficult to assess by self-report. And so you maybe don't even trust your self-reports that much. You want to try and do something other than that. So in this first study, we had participants write down some of their goals. We have about 2,200 participants. These are all college students, but they're from universities all across the country. And they each wrote 3, so we have about 6,600 goals. And they're pretty short. They're things like, I want to balance work and school. I want to be open-minded, make at least one person smile every day, do my daily devotional, or not be shy when an opportunity to express my faith arises. So the task, in one sense, is really simple. Let's just find these. Find the spiritual goals. In another sense, it's really complicated. What does it mean to be a spiritual goal? That's a kind of hazy, nuanced kind of idea. So first what we do is have some humans do this, and they did remarkably well. So this is Elizabeth Bounds on the bottom left. She's one of these 3 humans. But then we also have a couple of undergraduate RAs, and they spent, as I understand, about 6 months working together on this. And the results speak for themselves. 0.96, 0.98, these are Cohen's kappas. Those are incredible. That's phenomenal iterator reliability. So how does GPT do? Well, GPT-4 does about as well. GPT 3.5, maybe a little bit less well. But GPT 3.5 is faster and cheaper. Took GPT 3.5 about 7 minutes, whereas GPT-4 took about 20. So if Cohen's kappa of 0.95 is good enough for you, well, then maybe you'd be fine with GPT 3.5 instead of 4. Save yourself a few bucks. So let's do something even more complicated. So now we had a kind of nuanced construct, but it was still just a dichotomous yes, no, is this goal spiritual? Let's do something continuous. I want to know now, not is this goal spiritual or not, but is this person spiritual and how? How spiritual is this person? So the task here is going to be an essay writing task. So we have about 357 participants. They each wrote 2 essays in response to 2 different prompts. And here again, the idea is, like I was mentioning towards the beginning, I'm not just going to ask, how spiritual are you? Please explain. Or tell me about your spiritual beliefs. Instead, I'm going to give you an opportunity to say something that makes it clear that you're spiritual or not, but I'm not going to say anything about it directly. So here's the first prompt. This one is called dream. Imagine that you have a dream that a faraway loved one, maybe your grandmother or somebody, unexpectedly visits to say that they love you and to impart some life wisdom. You wake up to learn that they died the previous night. Please tell us how and why you think that happens. Some people will say things like, it's just a coincidence. Other people will say, I think people have like a really deep bond that links them. And so, or something like that. Sometimes they're really explicit. They're like, I think it was her spirit who came and visited me. And, so all kinds of different things that people will say. The second essay prompt is called deja vu. So this one says, imagine you meet somebody for the first time. You share an uncanny sense that you've known each other for decades. Please explain how and why you think this happens. Same kind of thing. Some people talk about past lives and stuff, really explicit. Some people say, I don't know, probably they remind me of somebody. So there's everything all over the place. So we scored these using both a human, a trained RA, and GPT-4. The RA met with me several times. We talked about the operative definition of spirituality. We just took it right out of existing literature, Ralph Piedmont, 1999, if you're curious. And we said, okay, here's the definition. Let's go through some examples together. So he and I sat down, we went through about 20 of these examples. We did them independently at first. We said, why did you say that? We did the standard stuff. We met together. We got to the point where we were unanimous on those examples. And then we said, okay, you're going to go off and do the rest. So he did the other, there's 700 and whatever. Then we also have 2 different scoring methods. So one scoring method was just, here's the definition. To what extent does this apply? 1 to 7. The other scoring method used items from a self-report that we then just kind of adapted. So we said, instead of this person, or instead of, I think, I feel, et cetera, the statements are now this person thinks, this person feels. But then it was an observer report kind of scale in that way. So we just took those 4 items and we said, to what extent do you think these are true of the person who wrote this text? So from these, we can look at inter-rater and intra-rater reliability. We have 4 items from an observer rating scale. We can look at the internal consistency of that measure. We have 2 different scoring methods, so we can look at the correlations between those 2 methods within a rater. We can also look at the intra-class correlations between the raters. Say these are consistent between each other. But then what about validity? Well, we have self-report measures, including the spiritual transcendence scale. This is a pretty standard trait self-report measure of spirituality. We also have 5 weeks of daily diary. So every night for 5 weeks, participants answered some questions about their spiritual experiences and behaviors during that day. And then I'm just going to average across them for a kind of trait level measure of spirituality. So this reflects kind of 2 different ways of trying to assess a trait. There's the kind of old school, we just have this retrospective report of how are you in general. But then we also say, okay, we want to know how you actually are in general. We're going to assess you every single day for a while, and we're going to try and aggregate that into a trait level score. And in fact, what I ended up doing, because they were strongly correlated, is converting those. There were 2 items from the daily diaries plus the trait measure, so we make a latent variable out of those, and that's going to be our self-report score. We also have a decision-making task. This is a slightly unusual measure. It's not super common. Patty's used this kind of thing before. We were copying her. But basically what we did was we said, we're going to have you make some choices. We're going to give you 2 pairs of either books or videos, and we just want to know which one would you like to watch. So we said, imagine you had some free time and you decided that you're going to watch a video or read a book. Which of these would you rather read? Would you prefer to read Sam Harris, Waking Up, or Silicon States by Lucy Green? Which would you choose? How about Failed Mission to Find God and What I Found Instead, or How Nationalism and Globalism Can Coexist? Of course, what we did with these was pre-test a whole bunch of them. We had over 40 of them, and we were looking for pairs of books and videos that are matched in terms of how interesting are they in general, and very different in terms of how spiritual do they seem to people. So just, it's tiny text, you don't need to look at it, but on the left is the scores for how interesting this seems, and on the right are the scores for how spiritual does this seem. And then the colors just indicate which choice. So for each choice, interest does not differ, but spirituality does. So that's the idea. And then what we want to know is basically, do you choose the high spirituality option or the low spirituality option? That's the basic idea. So think back again. We have 2 essays scored in 2 ways by 2 different coders. So we can look at the way in which those are associated with each other within and between kind of coders. So in the dream essay and the deja vu essay, we have that scale-based rating, which is 4 items. So what's the internal consistency of those 4 items for each rater? Well, between the 2 essays, they're about 0.9. So that's pretty good, internal reliability. But then what's the correlation between the 2 scoring methods? Well, for GPT-4, it was about 0.85, for the human 0.95. And then for the deja vu essay, it's a little bit lower for GPT than for the dream essay. I actually think, so I will confess something here, I think the human correlation here is cheating. Because I'm pretty sure when the RA went through and did all of this by hand, he had a single spreadsheet with the 4 columns for the 4 statements of the observer report scale, and then a 5th one for the other one. I think he just did them all at once. Otherwise, I'm not really sure how he got 0.93, 0.95 between the 2s. So, a little bit cheating, but on that one. But even on GPT-4, when they're totally independent, it's not just that the 2 different scoring methods are totally independent. Every single time it scores an essay, unlike with a human, it has no memory of having ever scored any other essay. This is completely fresh every time. Separate API calls, right? So that's kind of cool. Like even though it's not as high as 0.93 or 0.95, we're still doing pretty well there between the 2 scoring methods. And then the intra-class correlations are about 0.7 to 0.8. According to a traditional threshold, 0.6 or higher is good, 0.75 or higher is excellent. Some people think that's a little bit too lax of a threshold. But in any case, we're in that range of kind of like good to very good. So that's looking nice. But again, we've got 4 observations per coder per participant, right? So GPT-4 has 4 observations, human has 4 observations. We can turn those into latent factors. We can say, give me the kind of overall aggregate score for GPT-rated spirituality and human-rated spirituality, and then what's the correlation between those? And that's 0.85. I just love these little figures. They're so, yes. You get up in the morning for these kinds of correlations. Okay, so now let's think about the validity question. So this is looking at the correlations with self-reports and the decision-making task. For the human, correlations weren't super duper strong, especially for the behavioral measure, but about 0.4 and about 0.25 correlations between the human rating and self-report and decision-making. So then the question, of course, is, well, how does GPT compare? And it's identical. 0.4, 0.25-ish. So this got me excited. This is currently a preprint available on SciArchive if you want to look at it. It's out for review at the moment at a journal that shall remain nameless. But that's kind of my most comprehensive, like I'm assessing the quality of these data that I've done so far, but it's not the only thing I've done. I think it's sort of suggesting that we really can maybe approach or reach even the gold standard of human coding. I think a lot of open questions still, and we can talk more about these later, but yeah, so that's very promising. Then let me just give you a couple more examples of things that I've done. In these 2 last examples, give you 2 more examples, then maybe we break and do some Q&A and then or whatever. But My colleagues at the Park Center for Ethics have made this series of videos about ethical dilemmas in partnership with TED Ed. And the idea with these videos is that they introduce an ethical dilemma, and then they try to give you some resources for thinking about that dilemma and how to resolve it. So it's very kind of philosophy, ethics, pedagogy kind of material. So there's, what we did is, we took these videos and cut them right after the dilemma was introduced. So there's all of this pedagogical material that's supposed to help you to think more open-mindedly, a little more rigorously, a little more systematically about this ethical dilemma. We took it online, we gave it randomly to participants, either the full version where they get all of that, or just the dilemma. Just introduce you to the question. And then we had them write, what do you think should be done? Why do you think that? What do you think are the most important factors to consider when making a choice in this kind of situation? And my colleague Michael Vasquez and a couple of PhD students in philosophy, both of whom specialize in ethics, then went through and rated them. So they rated them for intellectual humility. How sort of humble is this person's thinking about this question? They rated them for what we call justification, which is basically to what extent do they actually give reasons for their view, plausible, hopefully reasons that are supporting their view as opposed to just saying, this is the way it is. And then there's a third variable, which is sophistication, which is to what extent are they like really grappling with this as a nuanced question that people have differing ideas about, and it's complicated, and you got to sort of take that into account. So basically, how are they reasoning about it in a sophisticated way among these three variables, reasoning about it in a sophisticated way, recognizing the nuance, recognizing that they could be wrong about it, but also nonetheless taking a stand and saying, no, this is why I think what I think. That's the kind of idea. So first we have Michael and a couple of PhD students go through and score them. They got pretty good ICCs. And then I had GPT do it. And I told GPT, you are a philosopher specializing in ethics. And I gave it the same kind of stuff. Here, a little bit less rigorous in some ways than the spirituality, because we don't have like multiple different scoring methods and we don't have like multiple different items. It's a little more simple. Looking at the correlations there, they're still looking pretty good. And these aren't just, undergrad RAs who, were interested in doing some research scoring it. These are ethicists. These are like people whose job it is to think about ethical questions. And I managed to get pretty nice correlations there. So then what was the effect of this intervention? Watching the full video versus the short one. Well, it looks like there were effects on justification and sophistication, maybe one for intellectual humility, but that's kind of cool. In another program of research, last example, and then we can have some conversation. I've actually been really interested in pro-environmental behavior and well-being. Basically, I think people have this idea that like going green is bad for me. It's gonna suck. Like maybe I should do it. Maybe I'm morally obligated to do it for future generations or something like that. I don't want to do it. I want the big car and the big house and the new phone and all of that stuff. There's actually this whole huge body of research on this question though, and happiness and pro-environmental behavior are very robustly correlated. I've got some work currently under review that's actually experimentally intervening and saying, if we ask people to incorporate more pro-environmental behavior into their daily life, does that increase well-being? And according to this one study, it does. So if that's right, then could we tell people about that and thereby make them more motivated to do more for the environment? That would be really cool. So some other studies I've been doing, this is with Kate LaFawn at the London School of Economics. We present participants with some messages about this kind of research. Sometimes it's a personal narrative. Sometimes it's more just like a snippet from a science article. Just kind of telling people about this. And we have some self-report measures of like attitudes towards pro-environmental behavior and intentions to engage in it, standard kind of stuff. But we wanted to go beyond that. And so we said, okay, here's another kind of measure that we could use. Let's ask them to write a message themselves. Let's say, okay, based on what you've read, can you write a persuasive message? Can you say something that will encourage other people to go green? And then in one study, I just had some people on Prolific score how persuasive they are. Because ultimately that's what I care about. Is it actually persuasive to the real humans? And in fact, it was. So there was, we had these two messages. One was a control message and one was about talking about the way in which pro-environmental behavior can increase well-being. And so that did make people more persuasive. But then I thought in another study, can I do the same sort of thing, but without actually having to recruit a new group of participants? So it's a separate study. It's a separate data set of messages that participants in a new study have written. But I took GPT 3.5 and fine-tuned it, meaning although the whole idea of a GPT model is it's pre-trained to do domain general things, you can still give it more training data. So what I did was I took the 500 ratings from study 1, and I said, these are training data, emulate this, do what these people are doing. And then I had it score the messages from a second study, and there's sort of this drop in the overall mean level between the two. I'm not sure if that's something from GPT or if that's from just the fact that it was a different study with a different intervention for the original group that wrote the messages, but we were able to replicate the effect in this additional study. So I've been talking for too long now. Let's talk about it. What do you think? Do you have questions, ideas, riotous objections? Including Zoomers, if you're still alive out there. Yeah.
Hey, the folks chat GPT for each API pull.
It's not per poll. So if you use Chat GPT, it's free because it's just this chat interface, and they're using their data to train their next version of the model, and that's why it's free. If you use their API, then you have to pay. They don't store the data. I have a slide on that later because that is a concern. Are they holding on to these data? What are they doing with it? Do you have to tell participants that their data is being used to train a large language model? If you use the API, they don't store the data, but you do have to pay, and it's not per API call, it's actually per token. So a token is not exactly a word, but you could think of it as a word count. So how many words are you sending them, and how many are they sending back? That determines the cost. It's, so yeah, not free, but it is, or potentially can be quite cheap, especially if you're using the older model. So right now, GPT-4 costs, I think, 0.6 cents per token or something like that. And GPT-4 Turbo is like half of that. But if you use GPT 3.5, it's like 0.00 something cents per token. I mean, it's quite cheap. So that is a reason, like I was saying, this is something I think we are going to want to talk about during part 3, is if you think GPT 3.5 is going to do just as well or good enough for what you want to do, save yourself some money. It's also faster. Yeah.
Kind of a related question. Is there any variability in how well it does by like the length of
Heard that the odds of the model hallucinating increase as the length of the text gets longer. I haven't seen that, or at least I haven't explored it really in any kind of careful way. The longer the text, the more you're paying for each API call that you're scoring. So this is actually one of the things I want to talk about towards the end is like, when would you not want to use this? Well, if you have a lot of text, if you have like, I have this entire academic paper and I want you to tell me how intellectually humble is its author, I don't know, it's going to be costly. Maybe if you go GPT-3 and you say, well, we're going to take snippets from the paper, something like that, like maybe that would work. But yeah, I mean, one of the things you can do if you're not liking the results that you're getting is increase the length of your prompt by adding examples. So people distinguish sometimes between zero shot and few shot learning. So zero shot would just be like, how spiritual is this person? Go. No examples, no training, no nothing. Which is what I did actually in that spirituality study. I mean, I gave it the definition. I said, here's what we mean by spirituality. To what extent is this person spiritual? Like not at all to extremely 1 to 7. That would be zero shot. But if you're going, I don't really like the scores it's giving me, you can give it a couple of examples. And that can sometimes make a pretty significant change. That's extending the length of the prompt. And I think in that case, it's improving the scores. So yeah, brevity is good for speed and cost. Potentially less brevity is good for quality, depending on what additional stuff you're giving it. And maybe, to a certain extent, maybe like, if it gets way, way long, then it does start to hallucinate. Yeah. I think Rick might have been first.
Well, organic data, large, say, tweets.
Mm-hmm.
So if you do the kind of studies you've shown us, you generate or acquire data and make that available for GPT.
Yeah.
Do I have to go into Twitter or X and extract that and pull it down and then, or can I actually tell GPT, go to yourself, find tweets between this date and this date? In other words, can it actually collect the data and?
Yeah, I don't think so. So I think like with one of the ideas with Bard was, Bing is like, we're going to integrate the model with our search engine and allow it to basically go find information as opposed to just saying something based off of its training data or making something up, which is what GPTs were doing, at least at the start. And I think they pretty quickly realized they weren't ready for that. And I don't know what they're doing now if they've reintegrated that. But there was this whole controversy when it first came out about it saying all kinds of creepy things. And it was really weird. And so, yeah, if you just make an API call to OpenAI and ask it something, it doesn't have access to the internet to go search for things. So probably you'd want to first do the Twitter API, pull your messages, maybe even do a little bit of data cleaning to make sure this one's all garbled and unreadable anyway, so we don't want to score it. And then do the API calls to OpenAI. Yeah.
One, I think we may progress. GPT 3.5 on the more advanced now.
Yeah. I think I did, although I ended up not using it because GPT-4 was better. As I recall, my experience has been GPT-4 just gives me better scores. I just like what I see better. And that's in contrast to like in that RathJ paper where it looked like for the tweet classification, positive, negative, neutral, GPT-3 actually was doing a little better. I'm not sure exactly why that is. I think one of the reasons is probably got to do with what some people call prompt engineering, which I think a lot of people who are, excitedly writing up preprints on this topic haven't thought maybe quite enough about. But basically prompt engineering is figuring out how to write your prompt in exactly the right sort of way to get the right sort of result. The same sort of thing you'd have to do if you're working with undergrads, right? Like, so I think probably part of why there's like this divide, right? I mean, it's even reflected, like I was saying, in the language between, there's like the social psychology people who are used to doing it with humans and they do all of this work to try and make sure it's internally reliable and blah, blah, blah. And then there are the more computer sciencey, computational social science types who are just like, I don't know, like there's the human rating and I'm sure it's right. It's like, let's go. So I think with the former group, there's probably going to be a lot more thought about this kind of thing, about how exactly do I need to ask the question? And let me try a few different variations. That kind of thing, prompt engineering, I think is really important and I think is a little bit underappreciated on the other camp, which may potentially be why you get some of these weird things where like, how could it be that GPT-4, which does so much better on all the standardized tests and is like way more sophisticated, does worse? I don't know. Yeah.
And the second.
Question. Return for part 2. Yeah, so I'll show you a bunch of tools that are available. Some DIY stuff, you could try and do it straight in R if you want. Some automated tools that are available on the internet. But yeah, basically you're making API calls. So you got to get an API key, you got to get yourself set up on an account on OpenAI. And then the way I'm doing it is with a command line tool where it's not user friendly. I'm warning you, I'll do a live demo of it if people are interested. But if you're used to a nice graphical user interface or something, you're going to be a little scared. But yeah, so it's automated basically. It just loops through a CSV or something and does one at a time, or in batches, which is the way.
collected on stage and you said, okay, tell me, how spiritual are they, or how are they on these different variables?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something I've wanted to do. I don't think it's necessarily going to be as great for that. So I have a colleague at Baylor, Perry Glanzer, does a lot of qualitative work, and with long form like interviews and things. And we talked a little bit about trying to do this sort of thing, and what we ended up deciding, at least at the time, was you figure out the codes first, and then I'll apply them to many texts. That said, there are probably ways that you could use GPT models for that stage of a kind of thematic coding or something. And in fact, Atlas TI, I don't know if that's a software you're familiar with. I have some slides on this for later too, has recently integrated GPT models. And so if you have access to Atlas TI, ready to go. Well, you're already used to in your own ecosystem, yeah. If you don't have that, then another thing you could try is just go into ChatGPT and say, I'm going to give you 100 texts. And maybe you do them in batches, or you randomly select some or something, and you do them. Actually, it would be really cool if you could say, I have 500. I want to divide them into 5 random samples. And then I want to give each to ChatGPT, and I say, you tell me 5 to 10 categories or themes or whatever. If it gives you the same ones over and over, that's pretty good evidence that that's a real thing you want to hold on to. And then maybe you kind of keep doing that sort of thing. So there are ways of doing it that are not quite what I've been doing, that I think you could totally use. Yeah. You had a hand earlier?
I was just gonna ask the Zoom.
Should we have coffee? Oh no, Patty.
No, I just
Uh-huh.
said text analysis, what's cool is that
Yeah,
technology to tell us like this is a really important edit
right. Yeah,
is coming up a lot
that's right. Yeah.
without reading the text or knowing about it.
Great point. Yeah, I think that's right. So yeah, that's something we should be think about how to do more of and to do better. Yeah.
Well, so were you thinking of trying to get I was wondering if maybe all of the females might like quality more, or if there's a difference there.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a great point, and kind of a more general issue potentially would be, and one of these big open questions that we should be thinking about, and I want to talk with all of you about in part 3 is, might it be that GPT is better at picking up women's spirituality than men's, or vice versa? Might it be that it does better in English than in Arabic? Might it be that it's better at understanding certain things about people of certain racial groups? Who knows? Wouldn't be too surprising. So we should be thinking about that, and we should be trying to figure out, one, whether or not that's true, and where it's true if it is. Like which kinds of constructs, which kinds of, maybe demographic or linguistic differences, and what we can do about it. One thing you can try to do is things like, in that system prompt like I was showing, you can say, you're a philosopher, act like a philosopher, think like a philosopher. You might try to do something similar with think like a Democrat, think like a Republican. One worry might be, well, it's just going to use stereotypes or something, and it's not really doing that very well. But we could experiment with these kinds of things and try and answer these kinds of questions. Let's have coffee. Sorry, Zoom people, you don't get any. You can go have your own coffee.